It is Tuesday, August 31st, and welcome back to The Advantage, where we walk you through the latest in political ads and spending. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Ben. How's everybody doing this week? So we've been on a little bit of a hiatus for the summer.
Enjoying the summer.
While we traveled around and worked very hard. But so we are back to talk about some of the early money we're seeing in the House and the Senate. So we've seen about 3 times the outside money going into the House and the Senate in August than we saw in July. We've really seen a drastic uptick. And what's really interesting there is that the Democrats really seem to be on the defensive. There's a lot of different kind of messaging going around kind of on different topics, but broadly, Democrats in the House are getting a lot of flack basically for some of these difficult votes, in kind of swingy districts. They're getting a lot of outside help from Democrats, but they are under attack from Republicans. Whereas in the Senate, it's a little bit different, where there's a lot of Democrats under attack from the left, or under pressure, maybe is a better word than under attack, from the left. And then you also have Democrats on the offensive in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and places like that.
Yeah, we've really seen that reflected in the ads that are on air right now. Notably, House Majority Forward and the League of Conservation Voters both have a series of ads right now supporting potentially vulnerable Democrats across the country, from Virginia to New Hampshire. And they're defending Democrats on their record with COVID relief, touting what that has brought to people, defending what the infrastructure bill will mean for average Americans, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of jobs. We're not really seeing Democratic groups touch the $3.5 trillion spending package specifically. They're talking about some of the benefits that will come out of it without really naming the bill itself. On the Republican side, that has been one of the most popular things that Republicans are going after Democrats over, is this exorbitant spending. They're calling it a bailout for environmental extremists. They are going after Democrats on what they say is taking away voters' rights to their own healthcare decisions, socialist healthcare plans. It's the same conversation and fight that we're seeing play out across, news organizations and political conversations across the country, and it's very much hitting the airwaves right now.
What's interesting to me is that this feels kind of like a return to the normal political discourse in a little bit of a weird way, in the sense that the Democrats are talking about how the infrastructure bill is good because it takes money from the ultra-rich and gives it to the middle and lower classes.
Right.
And the Republicans are talking about socialism, tax and spend, and waste, which feels like a real return to kind of the pre-Trump era, where we're really debating tax policy and infrastructure and these things, rather than social kind of
the cultural issues.
Yeah, exactly, which I find really interesting.
I will be curious to see as this messaging progresses. Republican ads still have a tinge of that cultural fight, specifically invoking the term socialism. Democrats really toe the line of touting policy initiatives. And I think Republicans are finding what might wind up being a sweet spot between couching your conversation about a policy initiative in language that still energizes the base, and pulls in some of those broader cultural conversations, particularly ones that tie Democrats to socialism and to farther left members like AOC. There's a very specific Republican ad on air right now that we've seen employs a tactic we've seen over and over. It's got a picture of Nancy Pelosi and a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the only thing that ties them together is this spending package that every single House Democrat voted for. But AOC might continue to be a cudgel for Republicans hoping to win back more moderate voters.
What I find interesting too is we're seeing a little bit more of leaning into these cultural issues on some of the Democratic side. It's definitely not the mainstream of messaging, but some of these groups like Move On are running ads in DC and in Wisconsin that are explicitly saying, how can the super rich have enough money to send rockets into space, but not enough money to pay their taxes, which is a little bit of change in messaging to explicitly kind of go after individuals, and individuals representative of a class maybe, but individuals on the Democratic side, and using them as a cudgel against Republicans, which isn't something we've seen before.
No.
So there might be a little bit of a embrace of the kind of Republican strategy that you were just alluding to there.
Especially if, as the election season goes on, we see a return of conversations like critical race theory, which obviously was blasted across political news media for the last month or two. We didn't see it reflected in ads as much as you might have thought.
It's interesting, though, not from issue groups so much, but a lot of Republican candidates who are launching ads.
Especially state-level candidates.
State-level candidates, governor candidates, things like that, who are launching ads really, really early, a lot of the case. And in places like Nebraska for the gubernatorial race there next year have been talking about critical race theory. So I wonder if we're going to see a little bit of a change there where it's embraced a little bit more widely by the outside groups, because it so far hasn't yet been embraced.
Yeah, that's an important note. Most of the ads on air right now are from outside groups. The only candidates really are Virginia governor, California recall, and maybe a handful of state-level candidates. So as we get further into general election season, this whole conversation could change depending on what candidates themselves are talking about and where the conversation goes and where issue groups need to shore up specific messaging.
So I was going to say, I think we'd be remiss to not mention, foreign policy in Afghanistan right now when we're talking about messaging, because we haven't seen any of this messaging as of yet. And quite frankly, in the last couple of cycles, foreign policy, other than immigration, has not been a real topic of conversation. I wonder if we see that change. I mean, we've seen public support for Biden's foreign policy decline pretty rapidly recently. We don't know if that's going to stick, but I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a larger topic of conversation in the coming year.
Well, and I will be curious, the political memory isn't a long one, so a year from now, when we're facing down the midterm elections, I'll be curious to see if the withdrawal itself is still one of the main topics of conversation. The whole withdrawal has offered Republicans a lot of fodder to go after Democrats with. However, the ramifications of the withdrawal, like increased refugee numbers coming to the United States and what the foreign policy relationship looks like with allies moving forward and the situation in the Middle East writ large, I think will continue to be a really fluid situation. So I'll be curious what aspects of that Republicans decide to start picking at as we get into the general, if any, and how Democrats respond to that.
And you hit on kind of a key point earlier, is that what we think the key messaging is right now changes so quickly. It might seem like the end of the world, but if you think back to this point in 2019, the impeachment effort was supposed to be this huge deal. And did it get brought up from July of 2020 on?
Well, COVID hit and
COVID hit.
News.
You had kind of cultural upheaval around Black Lives Matter and defund the police, and things changed so quickly that I think groups are trying out a wide range of messaging right now, but I think we'd be remiss to really say that any individual one thing right now is going to be the issue of 2020.
Well, and so much has happened in, the first, 8 months of the Biden presidency. Who knows what's going to happen between now and Election Day, which isn't exactly a helpful statement, but it is the reality that this stuff moves so fast. And I think more than ever, candidates and issue groups are doing a really good job of reacting quickly and getting messages up on air that they know will resonate with their base.
And that's an interesting question. So it seems like we're seeing a more concerted effort to get on air early and provide either air cover for your members or go on the offensive against others. Because normally we've seen groups kind of wait till the last minute. You go up on air the last 10 weeks. Is that changing now? It seems like we're seeing more and more activity early, Is that representative of a trend, or is this just kind of a blip?
I can't answer that right now.
Why not?
But I do
Tell me what's going to happen next year.
I do think that one of the things that will play into that is the amount of spending, right? And that's what we've seen for the last 2 cycles, and with the amount of money we're projecting this year. Again, shameless plug, if you haven't seen our spending projections, you can download them on our website. But we're projecting almost an equal amount of money as we saw in a presidential year that had 2 billionaires running on the Democratic side and a highly contentious presidential race.
I forgot about Tom Steyer.
I know.
Sorry.
And that amount of money just gives untold opportunities for candidates and their PACs and supporters to just bombard the airwaves with whatever the messaging of the moment seems to be.
Right, and if we're projecting equal money with no presidential race, that means more money in each individual Senate and House and governor's race, which is kind of a key point, that it's even more focused around these individual kind of important races and kind of turning points in the election.
Yeah. The last thing that I want to touch on, just because we brought it up briefly and I do think it's important, it's been really interesting the way that COVID has really taken the back seat. I mean, there was a period in time where it was 50%, if not more, of all advertising on air had something to do with the pandemic. Obviously, vaccines have helped tamp things down, unfortunately not for the unvaccinated, as we know, but the situation writ large has really evolved since January, when it was the middle of winter and nobody was vaccinated and everything was really skyrocketing. So I'll just be curious as we come into the latter parts of the year, who's going to get hit, where, how. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation around more red states and how they're handling the pandemic, but blue states are being hit hard too. So does that come back as a messaging piece, or does it kind of fade into the background now that there's so many other things to discuss and life seems to have returned to more of a normal than it was 8 months ago?
Absolutely. Yeah, that'll be interesting to keep in mind as the weather gets colder and we potentially see yet another wave, how that plays out in the environment.
So stay tuned. Next week we are going to do a bit of a deep dive on the California recall effort coming up to that election on September 14th. As always, if you have questions, you can reach out to Ben at the email address listed below. And have a good week.
Thanks, everybody.